Have you ever wondered why operas are full of screaming men singing high-pitched melodies? Or why do we even have operas?
I don't like the opera. What are they singing for? Who sings? You got something to say? Say it!
Today we will find out why the people who invented the opera didn't think talking was enough, and why the first musical stars of human history were castrated. The 16th century was a period of intense transformation, both in music and society in general. After a long period of deteriorating living conditions, a lot of things seemed to be finally on the right track. This was the start of a period of commercial growth. Population started increasing. Luxurious commodities became more and more common, and a new class of people became central to the functioning and the prosperity of society. These were the merchants and the bankers who provided the most important fuel for the capitalist system, the hope to make profit. All these social changes meant that the arts also needed to change. See, before that, during the Middle Ages, music was focused on religious ceremonies. The most highlighted musical practice of the time was the singing of religious texts in the Catholic Church. This type of music followed strict rules of composition. You couldn't just sing whatever you felt like. Every single note needed an explanation and needed to conform to certain rules which described what note you started on, how you moved, and what note you ended with. But everywhere the monopoly of the Catholic Church on power was decreasing. In 1517, Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses. Within the next 20 years, new translations of the Bible to German, English, and French appeared. And given that this was the age of the printing press, they quickly circulated and caused a massive reform movement. The type of church music we just encountered wasn't suitable for the new type of society that was emerging. Luther himself was a musician who wanted much simpler music so that everyone in the church could take part in the singing. This was a cultural crisis, a crisis of identity, which was being reflected in the need for a new type of music. Now, historically speaking, when faced with an identity crisis, European societies have often resorted to two solutions. Look up to the ancient Greeks or exterminate all the Jews. Now, luckily they went with the first one here. So, musicians started to get inspired by the ancient Greeks. And there was specifically one thing in the ancient Greek concept of music that was really interesting and kind of new to 16th century composers. Even today, it's hard not to be surprised by the way Plato or Aristotle described how music moved a person's soul or caused corruption in it. Especially in the 16th century, you read these descriptions and then you compared it to this. Like, damn, there must have been something really special going on in ancient Greek music. All musicians agreed that the special sauce of Greek music was emotion. Church music avoided emotions because it was focused on worshiping God. So, the music that was to affect the listeners had to focus on human emotions. That meant new ways of writing music, something that Claudio Monteverdi later described as the second practice, a way of composing music which tried to match the emotions of the words, as opposed to first practice, which was the older, more strict and rule-following way of composition. Within a short period of time, there was an explosion of emotional pieces of music. Even church music became more emotional and moving. William Byrd's Psalms and Sonnets of Sadness and Piety, Palestrina, Gabrieli, Monteverdi, and tens of other composers started paying attention to how their music aroused and played with the emotions. The most memorable example comes from John Donlan's first book of songs, a song called Flow My Tears. Okay. I don't know about you guys, but I definitely felt some corruption in my soul. But the church wasn't the only institution that was changing. Even the royalty was going through changes. They were becoming more and more powerful. Before the Renaissance, popular revolution happened, of course, from time to time, but starting in the 15th century, they became bigger and more common.
Royal blood? Yuck.
But every time they got crushed. So royal families became more and more authoritarian. They started looking for ways to show their power and grandeur at times of peace in order to constantly remind everyone of their importance. And what better way to do this than having big, expensive events in which large groups of people have to act in harmony? In fact, this later caused the birth of the orchestra too. In 1656, Louis XIV, the King of France, who was so obsessed with glory he called himself the Sun King, created the first version of the modern orchestra for his royal court. But long before Louis XIV, another royal family was already thinking about creating a big art form to show their glory. This was the Medici family. In 1581, Henry III of France, whose mother was Catherine de' Medici, was arranging a royal marriage. One of the programs of that wedding was called the Queen's Comic Ballet. Not comic in the sense of being a comedy, but in the sense of being a light-hearted work with a happy ending. The plot was derived from ancient Greek mythology. The antagonist was an evil sorcerer, and the play ended with the pious and virtuous King Henry III destroying that vile and evil woman with all her corrupting influences. Nothing too serious, of course, because it was a wedding. But the event was interesting because it brought everything together. There was sweet and emotional music. There was a group of people performing a long and elaborate dance. There was poetry and political allegory, and all of this was done at a level never seen before. In 1589, there was another event by the Medici family. Another marriage, this time happening in Florence. At the time, when spoken plays were being performed, the free time between two acts was filled with a short scene called intermedio. These intermedi included singing and dancing, and over time they became so elaborate they even started to overshadow the actual play. The wedding we're talking about right now was one of those events where the intermedi completely outshined the main play. Again, the theme was influenced by ancient Greece. It started with the Platonic idea of the music of spheres. It involved muses, or the Greek goddesses of music, Apollo and Python. The scenes included the underworld, the sea, and the heavens. It was one of the craziest events of the century. By now, every element of the opera was in place. They just hadn't come together in that form. Seeing these events, all influenced by ancient Greek themes, was an artistic stimulation for a group of musicians. Jacopo Corsi started gathering artists in his house, and they spent hours talking about the possibilities of an art form that could bring all of these influences together in a huge dramatic work. So the idea of opera as a giant musical drama modeled after the dramas of the ancient Greeks emerged. Corsi collaborated with Jacopo Peri in the mid-1590s on a completely sung pastoral play called Daphne, and in around 1600 Peri composed Eurydice, the first opera that has survived. 7 years later, Monteverdi, the guy with the two practices, composed Orfeo, the first operatic masterwork in history. The opera quickly became popular everywhere in Europe. Opera houses started opening, and this music wasn't just for the royal courts. Ordinary people could buy tickets and attend the opera, something that had never happened before. So famous opera singers reached the level of fame across all Europe and among ordinary people that was completely non-existent before them. But now came another problem. One of the opera's early centers was the city of Rome. But at the time, the church in Rome did not allow women to sing or appear on the stage. This was a more serious problem. I mean, what are you gonna do? Castrate a bunch of little boys so that their voices don't get deep when they grow up, and then have them dress up as women and play those roles? That would be absurd. Now, it turns out someone actually did pitch this idea to the church, and the church looked at the idea and they were like, well, I guess it makes more sense to castrate some men than to give all women equal rights. So yeah, why not? And this is how castrati were born. They started castrating hundreds or even thousands of boys every year. These kids then had to practice music basically all day long, every day, so that they could become opera stars at an early age. These stars were so fundamental to the success of an opera that a work didn't have a leading role for a castrati, it was doomed to fail. Of course, this practice of castration wasn't adopted everywhere, but it was so common, and the careers of these singers was so enticing that some struggling families even started castrating their own kids in the hope that they might someday become a giant music star.
You fucked my sausage.